Municipal Finance 101. We're going to spend the next hour or so going over Municipal Finance 101 and just some of the basic terms in municipal finance that you'll see come up at town meeting and throughout the budget cycle, as well as a little bit about where the town's money ends up coming from. We have 4 main revenue sources that we'll go through. Before I get started, does everyone have a copy of the PowerPoint if you want to take notes or make any scribbles? All right. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tony Mizuko, the town manager. I think most of you know me, but I had a staff training last week where I didn't announce myself, and somebody came up to me afterwards and asked me if I worked at the police department. So decided to make a point of continuing to announce myself at every meeting I attend. We're going to go ahead and jump right into tonight's presentation. These are some of the topics that we're going to cover, some in great detail, some just sort of in a cursory manner. We're going to talk about what a stabilization fund is, what free cash is, reserve and revolving funds, our revenue sources. We're going to dig into the state aid formulas a little bit so everyone knows how that critical money comes to the town and how those determinations are made. We're going to talk a little bit about our utility funds, debt service and the credit rating. Quick brief presentation on just really what budgets are, what audits are, what we mean when we talk about capital. And we're going to talk a little bit about Proposition 2.5 and the tax rate and some of the misconceptions around Prop 2.5 and even a little bit of the history of Prop 2.5 and how it actually works in reality. As always, feel free to stop me and just ask any questions as we're going through. If we do get too many questions, we'll hold them to the end, but I think the crowd is sufficient that we can probably ask questions as we go through. So just feel free to raise your hand and ask a question, and we can go from there. So I always start when we talk about municipal finance, what money do you have in the bank is always where you need to start, and that's why we start talking about what we call a stabilization fund. Massachusetts is unique in the country in terms of what we use words for. No one else tends to use words for. So a stabilization fund is really a savings account. And the stabilization fund, because you can have multiple stabilization funds, is really the town's primary savings account. Sometimes referred to as a rainy day fund. And it's really there to accumulate money for any specific purpose we want to designate it to, but it's really the town's primary savings account. Right now there's about $4.8 million in the stabilization account. And that may seem like it's a lot of money, but if you remember that the town of Norwood's about a $195 million entity every year, that'd be the equivalent if you made $195,000 a year and you had $4,800 in the bank. So when you think about it, that was your income level, that's how much money you had in case of an emergency. It's actually not that substantial, and we don't really have other money behind that. So you might have somebody who says, well, maybe I only have $5,000 in the bank, but I got a retirement fund, and then I got some equity in the home, and here and there. We don't have those things. So really the only savings we have in the bank is our stabilization fund. So it's one of the most important financial indicators that a town has. Best practices out there that you should keep between 5 and 10% of your, what we would call your general fund or your operating budget in your stabilization fund. But that number's a little bit tricky for Norwood in the way that we do a few things. So most towns segregate out their utility funds, so water, sewer. Not too many towns have light, but we do. So they sort of account for those separately, and then they just have their regular town budget over here. And that's what you base your stabilization fund on. But we sort of combine all of our funds. Some would say we commingle them, which is not the best accounting practice in the world, but there's nothing illegal about it. It's just a matter of we sort of throw everything into one pot. Now that's got some pluses and minuses. On the good hand, it means that the town benefits from the light department and for the water and sewer in terms of what we call the general fund or our general property tax revenue. The bad side is when one of those funds takes a hit, the general fund also takes the hit. So you can make an argument that do we do 5% of the $195 million or just what our town, school, and what we call shared or fixed cost expenses. In a perfect world, everyone would say, well, just do 10% of the whole thing all in and the town will have plenty of money in the bank. I agree. I'd love to be sitting on $19 million in the bank. The problem is if we did 10% of our total operating budget, and some of these numbers are last year, between 5 and 10% will be $9 to $19 million. That's great. Where do we get the money from? We wouldn't have that amount in the bank at the current rate that we're contributing until fiscal 53. So here's one of those issues where we have to balance between being fiscally conservative and responsible, maintaining the town's credit rating, which we'll talk about, but we also have to be realistic. We don't just get to pick the number we want in our fund balance. We get to pick, we can set a target, and we have a good target, and we can add to it, but that money has to come from somewhere. So this year in particular, if we said, you know what, we want to put more money into the stabilization fund, it has to come from somewhere. Well, where do we take it from? We only have so much available revenue. Do we cut departments? Do we not spend money on roads? Do we not repair buildings? So it's never as simple as just put more money into the bank because we want more money in there. It comes into competition with everything else in the budget. You'll see that in a few other areas throughout the evening. So even a more realistic goal, if we wanted sort of 7% of our, what we would say general government, which is the town departments, the school department, which is our largest single department, and then we use the term shared costs. Many other communities use the term fixed cost, and that refers to pensions, health insurance, and our debt obligations, which you're legally obligated to fund. So those are not things we could just cut or decide not to fund in one given year. So we're still about 9 years away from if we wanted to hit a 7% target. Here are the targets if we wanted to add in the water and sewer, and then if we wanted to add in the light department, we'd be getting all the way down to fiscal 53. The reality that we'd say 10% of all in is realistically not going to happen unless we saw a cash windfall one year and we didn't have another use for it, and we said, well, just stick it in the bank so we'll get there. But why keep money in the bank beyond just it's a safety issue? We had a culvert collapse on the under the Dean Street Bridge this year. We were able to borrow that, but that's about $1 million project. So if we ever actually had a major bridge collapse or a major road collapse, those can very quickly run into the millions of dollars. The last town I worked in had some road washouts this past year. They were not able to get an emergency declaration from the federal government, so they had to go out and borrow a little over $2 million to do some road repair, and that's for a town with about a $10 million budget. So that would be the equivalent of us having to just on the fly borrow $40 million because you don't have a couple dollars in the bank. So, yeah.
Could you just said it a little quickly?
Sure.
The shared costs and fixed costs, the three things you said were in that?
Sure. So they're primarily made up of health insurance, other insurance, so our building and property and things like workers' comp, pensions, so our pension obligation, and then debt service, so money that we owe. Again, we use the term shared costs because we have a shared cost formula, but most towns tend to refer to those as their fixed costs. Yep.
Has Norwood ever had 10% in stabilization?
I'd have to check back, probably not. I'd have to look over the last 10 years. We took some out of stabilization about 4 years ago, Bernie, for the DPW building. About 4 years ago, we essentially took some money out of the bank to put a cash down payment on the DPW building and reduce the amount we were borrowing. The credit rating agencies, which is what I'm going to get into in a second, don't actually like that. They would prefer that you borrow. The challenge comes between, are you talking about borrowing for a large project or a small project? We do a lot of borrowing for smaller projects. A large project, there's no question you're going to borrow for. So a $15 million building, we are not likely to ever have that amount of cash just hanging around to say, here's $15 million. The city of Cambridge, incidentally, has around 90 some odd million dollars in their free cash account, so they could literally go buy a new middle school and just cut the check for it. But Cambridge is a little unique. The other reason we look at how much money we want to keep in the bank is it has to do with our credit rating. So cities and towns get a credit rating just like you or I get a credit rating. It works a little bit differently, but really what they look at is how much money you have in the bank and then what your debt level is. We don't really get credit for paying our bills on time because we have to pay our bills on time. So it's not like when you go get a mortgage and you say, well, I've been paying my car note for the last 4 years, so I have decent credit. The credit rating agencies really don't care. They know you have to pay your obligations on time. We get rated based on how much debt we have versus how much cash we have in the bank. They look at our overall financial flexibility. The rating agencies are looking more and more into your management, what you're actually doing with your finances, what your policies are, your practices are, and they're starting to trend a lot more, whereas maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago, it was sort of a, let's take a snapshot of your town's finances and see how they look and tell you whether you think we're good. They're looking at trends. They're also looking at economic trends in the community, and that way you don't have a situation where there's a community that maybe its books look really good, but they don't have the underlying economic capacity to borrow or to carry a certain amount of debt. So that's something that 10 years ago they really didn't do. Now you have communities where the local government has plenty of money, they do everything right, they have good policies, but they're saying, looking at the overall property wealth and the income level in your community, you're not quite hitting that top bond rating. Now why does that matter? Just like when you go to borrow money for a car or a home, your interest rate has a huge impact on what you pay. It's the same thing for us. So if you were to take a $40 million project, the difference between where we are, which is good, we're AA+, so we're right below the highest credit rating you can have. It's sort of a tenuous AA+. We're on the scale of teetering down a little bit. Sometimes when you meet with bond agencies, you can sling a lot of good BS and they'll say, all right, we'll kind of keep you where we are, but the last couple times our rating has been upheld, which is looked at every time we borrow money, there have been more and more sort of, you got to change a couple of things, you got to keep a little bit more money in the bank, you got to make some policy changes. So you don't rarely go from, you'll almost never go from being sort of second from the top down to junk bond status. That doesn't happen. You sort of drop down in notches, but we've hung out where we are, but with that sort of stern, pretty soon it's not going to be there. But the difference between where we are at a AAA bond rating for a $40 million project could be between $5 and $7 million, so we average it at 6 over the life of a project. Now, I picked $40 million as an example because that's roughly the cost of our share of a new middle school. It's probably closer to $50 million. But you can talk about that credit rating has a huge impact on how much money the town spends over time. People don't always like to see that, but it's just like your mortgage. Anyone who's who's had a mortgage, you know if your percentage goes up or down, what you end up paying over that 30-year mortgage is a huge, huge difference. So this is one of the main reasons our credit rating is important, and the Stabilization Fund is really the #1 fund that they look at when they're looking at our credit rating. Free cash, another fund balance we like to look at, and also it's a term that is used in Massachusetts and nowhere else in the world, and I've actually spent time trying to research this because it's just a Massachusetts term. It's not free. There's no such thing as free money. It's actually not cash. It's a statement on our balance sheet that the Commonwealth allows us to spend. Those of you who work in the nonprofit world know a lot of nonprofits have their undesignated fund balance, so it's sort of the money that they have left in any given year, or is sort of sitting in their pot that is unallocated. It's actually not even our undesignated fund balance. It's sort of a number above that that the Commonwealth certifies we have available. People think of Massachusetts as Taxachusetts, which is actually statistically not the case anymore, but they don't realize that cities and towns are actually governed pretty conservatively in Massachusetts, and the state has some pretty strict regulations on how we budget, how we finance, what we're required to do, and how we handle our municipal finances. You go to some places, you go to Texas, it's the Wild West. Maine is the Wild West. You can do whatever you want with your finances. I worked in northern Maine. We adopted revenue budgets and expense budgets separately. We sometimes didn't adopt our expense budget until 3 months into the year because the council would kind of dang it over and say, well, we're not sure we like it. We may want to just make cuts and cut it down. So we're much, much stricter in Massachusetts. We have a typical fiscal year that starts July 1st and ends June 30th. But anyway, free cash is surplus from a prior year. It's unexpended budget lines. It's revenue over what we've projected. And this Commonwealth comes in, they certify how much we have, and then it's available to appropriate the following year. So it's considered a one-time revenue source because you never really know how much you're going to have. You don't know where your revenues are going to come in. They could come in under or over. You will always have some budget turnbacks, but you can't predict your budget turnbacks until you get to the end of the year. Yep.
Just on the unexpended budget line,
Yep.
would that be, so at the special town meeting, we readjusted or reallocated unspent within a department?
Yep.
If we didn't do that, then those funds would then become free cash?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, and I have a quick example I'll show you in a minute of multiple examples for free cash. So it's surplus revenue, so it's revenue we collected in excess of our projections. And at the end of the day, a budget's not a perfect document. It's a best guess as to how you're going to spend your money. And I know some folks will tell you, well, a budget's a statement of priorities and this and that, and that's true, but at the end of the day, it's a really good guess at how you're going to spend your total budget. We project revenues the same way a business would project revenues. We say, well, we think we're going to get $1 million in ambulance revenue. What do we base it on? You look back at your historic averages. You try to anticipate any market changes. But your numbers can go up and down based on the economy, based on trends, projects you didn't anticipate. So if we project, let's say, $1 million in building revenues, or let's use 100 grand as an easy example, and we happen to collect 105, somebody builds an extra house, that's great. That $5,000 becomes free cash. Incidentally, we can't then go and spend that money without it being appropriated by town meeting. So it closes to your free cash balance. Town meeting then has to appropriate it. Budget turnbacks are where we didn't spend money out of a budget. Sometimes that's a matter of it just somebody left a position. I'll use an example in a minute. Or sometimes the department doesn't always spend its budget down to zero. The prior year's free cash also factors in, but remember, free cash is calculated not actually on July 1st. We don't have a number until October. But I say it dies on June 30th, which means as of June 30th, you have no free cash. Then you submit your books to the state. They look through everything, they calculate it, and they tell you this is now what your free cash number is. Reasonably, if you had end of the year with $1 million in free cash, your next year you should have at least that $1 million plus everything else, but your free cash can go down, so you may not have that $1 million. Yep.
Do you folks figure out the numbers before you give the books to the state?
We come up with our own sort of, this is what we think our free cash number is, and then the state comes up with their number, and then we sort of fight it out to see who's right. They always win at the end, but sometimes there's just they'll look at our books a little differently, and they'll say, oh, nope, this $100,000, you don't have it. And we'll say, no, here's what it is. It was a grant, we did this, and then we had to move this money around. So there's never always a meeting of the minds. Mm-hmm. I should say there's always a meeting of the minds at the end, though they will win. Yeah.
Why does the state get into it? Because this is money that came into the town. So here's the state telling us how much we have that we collected?
They tell us everything that we can and cannot do. And part of the reason is that cities and towns in Massachusetts are actually political subdivisions of the Commonwealth. So we only exist because the state legislature has granted us the authority to exist as a town. And in theory, they could take that authority away from us. They're also, in theory, bound to any of our debts and our expenditures. So we only exist because the state gives us permission to
Is
exist.
that unusual in the country?
No, most cities and towns are actually some sort of a political subdivision. The level of local control versus state control varies widely in cities and towns throughout the country. The state has a lot more control of our finances than in other places. And we'll talk about it in a little bit. We can't create taxes that we just can't make up a tax. If we wanted to do a soda tax, is always the example I use because everyone hears about it in the news. We can't do that. The state has to give us the authority to do it. Most of the rules and regulations we manage our finances by are strictly governed by state law. There's not a whole lot of local input that we can have. The whole free cash system, what we call it, how we generate it, how we look at it, that's all dictated by the state. Whereas again, in Maine, when it comes to municipal finance, we can do whatever the heck we wanted. Yep.
What is the particular organization in the Commonwealth that does this?
It's the Department of Revenue, and it goes through the Division of Local Services. So there's two areas where we tend to have what I would call a threat to free cash, or things that tend to decrease our free cash balance. And the reason this is important is we did 1.7 million in free cash this year. My last year in the town of Adams, we had done, I think, 1.3, and that was on a $9 million operating budget, 9.7. We have a $191 million operating budget. Needham is doing $8 or $9 million in free cash. Rentham closed last year with 3.3 million. So for the size and scope of our budget, our free cash generation is actually pretty minimal. One of them is when you continue to cut operating budget lines, and that happens, we do it. You know, we're budgeting $10,000 for the lecture hall at the high school every year, and you say, gee, you're only spending $7, just cut it down to $7. Well, that extra money doesn't go into free cash. Not that you budget just to go in free cash, but sometimes that's what happens is we start clipping all these budget lines just to get through, but you're seeing it by not generating the financial flexibility on the other end. The other one is we do have a habit of trying to book the maximum amount of revenues we can legitimately book. And in terms of state control, the state also regulates what we can reasonably book for revenues. So if we were to make a wild projection just to get the budget to balance, the state will come in and say, you can't do that. You need to roll that number back. Whereas again, in comparison in Maine, they would pretty much let you do whatever you wanted, which cities would then just invent revenues at the end of the year to make their budget balance. The state lets you do not the best things in the world, but if we're averaging $1.4 million in ambulance receipts, I can't say, well, we're going to do 2.5 next year, the budget's balanced. They're going to say, prove it. You show us something that actually justifies you increasing that number, that amount. You never carry that amount. If I could say that, look, we've doubled our billing, or we've started doing the ambulance runs for a whole other town, they might let you get away with it, but they generally don't. As I said earlier, there's always this tension in the budget process between you want to do what's right versus you do have real needs in front of you. So let's say we collected $1 million in building permits last year, or $100,000, and we say, well, let's book 100 grand this year. Now somebody's going to say the right thing to do is say, you may not get that 100 grand. Why don't you book 90 grand? You can reasonably assume you're going to get 90,000. But by not booking that extra 10,000, I don't have it to spend over here, which means I may have to cut it over here. So there's that sort of central tension in where you're booking your revenues, where you say, well, let's take a little bit of a risk and book 100% of that revenue from the prior year, versus I don't want to have to go cut things over here when I think I can solve it. So it's a challenge. You got to be, you can't be too conservative that your revenue projections are so off that it's great you're generating free cash, but you're cutting all your services. We're here to provide services. On the other hand, when you're constantly saying, hey, we did 1.3 million in building permits last year, let's book it this year, and then you do 900,000, it's eating away at your free cash and your financial flexibility. You're booking a revenue that you're nowhere near actually going to hit. So a couple quick free cash analysis, and this gets your point about when we have money left over in the budget. We have an employee who earns $1,000 a week. We budget $52,000 for that employee's annual salary. They leave our service and the position's vacant for 5 weeks. At 5 weeks, we hire somebody at the exact same salary. Well, what does that mean? We budgeted 52 grand. We only spent $47,000. We have $5,000 left. That becomes free cash. Or at a special town meeting, we can then appropriate that to somewhere else. And the Finance Commission in Norwood has always preferred to sort of move money in the budget and have it not go into the next year's free cash. At the end of the day, it's going to work one way or another. So whether I move this money over to a department budget or take it out of free cash, I'm either decreasing this year's free cash and increasing next year's, or vice versa. It doesn't have a net impact if it's either coming from the current year budget or would otherwise come from free cash. Another example, revenues. We budget $100,000 for building permits, a little bit slower than we anticipate. we close, we only have $95,000. The amount that we're short would then come out of your free cash calculation. So I throw these examples up here just to show you that in any scenario, you could do really well with free cash, you could do bad with free cash. There are towns that do what's known as negative free cash, which means you technically ended your year in the red. That's a really bad situation to be in. Because light department receipts over what we project and water revenues over what we project and our broadband profits all flow into our free cash, we have a safety net, but that safety net is quickly eroding. So it's a cause that we have to look at some of what we're projecting for our revenues. We actually should be doing a lot more free cash than most communities, but we're doing less than communities our size. But you can see in any of these examples, let's say you had $100,000 left over, you ran your budget over, which you're not supposed to do, but it can happen. But we collected more revenues, but then we had some revenues under the estimate. So this year here, they only had 17 grand left, whereas this year, where they started with nothing, they ended up with 90,000 because they had some revenues way over estimates. Some of our revenue streams, and we'll talk about them in a minute, are more volatile. Some of them are very much based on the economy. But take building permits, for example. We don't know when we're going to get a big project in town. You can't always predict it. The Skating Club of Boston just pulled their building permit a few weeks ago. It's a $560,000 building permit. So that's great, but you can't always predict that a $30 million building is going to get built in town. We average a little over $1 million a year in building permits, but something like a large apartment complex too, it's great when you get one or two, but you don't know you're always going to get one per year. And to say, well, we do $1 million in building permits, but let's assume we get a $500,000 building fee in for one big project a year is a little bit too much gambling to take, because again, the skating club's a $35 million construction project, so you don't get too many of them in a given year. It's always good when we do, but that money comes back to us in the form of free cash in the following year. Questions on free cash? We can always come back to it if anything pops up. Bob, did you have a question? No? Okay. So really the town gets its money from 4 sources. They're a little bit more diverse than that, but there's the tax levy, what we call local receipts, state aid, and utility receipts. Now in your minds, you got to separate out this utility receipts, because utility receipts go to cover the cost of utility services, so those sort of go off to the side. State aid is about $13 million. That's money we get from the Commonwealth, primarily through 2 forms, and we're going to go into them. One is school aid. The other one is what we call unrestricted general government aid. We get about $15 million in local receipts, which includes excise tax, the meals tax, the hotels tax, building permits, fees, fines, copy fines, things like that. Ambulance revenue is about $1.3 million a year we get from billing out for ambulance service. And then this tax levy here, that's the property tax levy. That's what Prop 2.5 is based on, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So going into some of the different types of funds we have what's known as a reserve fund. It's about $125,000. This is the state definition of what a reserve fund is. It's money that the town puts up every year for unforeseen expenses in the given year. By statute, they're controlled by the Finance Commission. So this is money we raise every year in the budget, and if it doesn't get spent, it just goes into free cash like any other unspent amount. It's for unforeseen expenses, mainly on the general government side. It could be used on the school department side, but schools have what's known as a bottom line budget authority. So the Commonwealth in the early 1990s made a lot of changes to education and how education is managed. So the school department gets a $44 million budget. They can move at the request of the school committee money anywhere within that budget if they have to. The town side, if you will, general government, doesn't have the same flexibility. We're subject to that appropriation by town meeting. So if I have $30,000 left in the police budget, I can't just say, oh great, I can go, pave another road this year. Town meeting has to take that money from the police budget and appropriate it for roads. We have some flexibility within the budget lines, so if I have $5,000 for tree repair and $6,000 for bench repair, I can go ahead and move money around within the line. We use the term within the line. Same thing with our labor costs. If I have, one of the things you often see is if I have a salary line here and an overtime line here, somebody's out of work, well, you're paying more overtime, so this line goes up, but this line goes down. But I can't say, hey, great, I got $50,000 extra in police salaries, I'm going to go hire another health inspector with it. Town meeting has to take that money and change the appropriation. But the reserve fund is there for when you truly have an unforeseen expense. It's usually called contingency. Sometimes it's called the budget overlay in other towns. What we call a reserve fund in Massachusetts, the rest of the world generally calls it something different, but that's okay. We're Massachusetts and we can do it. So a perfect example is in a smaller department budget, you may have a repair cost. We try to budget an average amount for a building, what we think repairs are going to be. But for a smaller facility or a smaller department, something breaks and it's a $15,000 or $20,000 fix. Well, you can't always wait to call a town meeting to get that money. nor do you say, well, we could have a $50,000 break, so let's just budget all the money in the world for any possible repair. We don't have that amount of money to do. So a pipe breaks at Town Hall, we need $12,000 to fix it. The Town Hall plumbing budget is probably only $1,000 or $2,000, so that's what you go to the reserve fund for, something like that. Unforeseen expenses, unanticipated expenses. This year we chose to take money for the June 3rd election out of the free cash fund as opposed to the reserve fund. You could go either way. The net impact to the town is really no different, although the reserve fund is really there because it's not necessarily feasible to always call a town meeting every time you have to move $1,000 here or there. Incidentally, it costs us a couple $1,000s to call a town meeting, which is one of the other reasons you wouldn't want to constantly call a town meeting. And I think most town meeting members wouldn't want to necessarily show up an additional 8 times a year to approve, $4,000 because we lost some toilet paper in the bathroom into a small pipe break. Questions on the reserve fund? Revolving funds, getting fun here. So revolving funds are a fund design that we're allowed to operate under state statute where money comes in for something and then money goes out for that purpose. So one of the best examples of that is the recreation department. So we put on a knitting program and we got to pay the knitting teacher. So that cost is $20. That would go into the revolving fund and then that fund would then pay for that specific cost. So it's money that goes in for a specific cost and goes out for that. You can't profit off a revolving fund. You're allowed to make a little bit of your overhead and that usually goes towards your general programming. But if we were running knitting classes and making $100,000 a year profit off it, the state looks at that at the end of the year and they would quickly stop you and say you're not allowed to do it. Not that you're necessarily allowed to make money, but you can't just expend 20% of the fund and make a huge fortune off it. Our camps run off partially on revolving funds. The library has a revolving fund. I believe the senior center has a revolving fund where it could be for something simple as the senior center wants to offer coffee. It's not really a public service where we provide people free coffee, so everyone pays for their coffee. It goes into the coffee fund. It gets paid out of the coffee fund. We used to have to do about 10 or 12 of these a year to approve. The state has come along about 3 years ago. They went through a process of municipal modernization. They passed what we call the Muni Mod Bill or the Municipal Modernization Bill, allowing us to just establish a bylaw where we don't have to every year ask for permission for the senior center coffee club and things like that. Some of these, depending on the individual fund, will either close to the general fund or they'll stay with that department. But again, they're not a slush fund. They're not something where you can build up millions of dollars. Library fines, I think, go into the library revolving fund. So there again, we're not talking about collecting millions of dollars. School lunch is another example that runs off a revolving fund where the money gets paid in for the school lunch and it gets paid out to cover the cost of school lunches. Questions on revolving funds? State aid. So there's 2 different forms of state aid that makes up about $15 million of our budget, which when you subtract out the utility budgets, that's actually pretty substantial. It's more than 10% of our total revenue. Comes in 2 main sources. One we call Chapter 70, which is school aid. The other one is known as UGGA, or Unrestricted General Government Aid. In Norwood, we sort of pool everything together. So there's a variety of categories when we look at our state aid, and we're going to start with these are the, 3, 6, 9, 12, 13, 14 different categories of state aid. So when you see this, it looks great. You think, man, there's 14 different places that the state gives us money in. The actual reality is a little bit darker. Doesn't apply to us, doesn't apply to us, doesn't apply anymore, doesn't apply to us, doesn't apply to us, doesn't apply to us. They got rid of this years ago. Thank you, Deval Patrick. This doesn't apply to us. These 3 here are effectively washouts. We get money, but it's because there's also an expenditure in there as well. So it's not like it's profit, if you will, not that the town profits. So really, it comes down to Chapter 70 and what we call UGGA. Chapter 70, our aid to schools, one of the more complicated aid formulas that's out there. It theoretically ensures that every school district is paying an appropriate amount of money for an education and that the Commonwealth is helping that school district provide that bare minimum education. This came about in the states have always provided some sort of aid to education, but the current Chapter 70 formula came about in the early 1990s after we had education reform in the Commonwealth, triggered by the city of Brockton actually suing Massachusetts. There's a constitutional obligation to provide education in Massachusetts. The state has a responsibility to that as well, especially because we're political subdivisions of the state. They got sued. The Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts upheld the lawsuit, so the state had to come up with a lot more money for education, but they also came up with different restrictions and different formulas. So basically the state comes out with a foundation budget. They say this is what you should spend on education based on your wealth levels. This is kind of what you are spending, and they try to meet the gap in the middle. So they take our total student count, and remember, student population is very important when you look at the Chapter 70 formula. The dollar amount is applied to each student. based on the estimated cost to provide education per student. They then come up with a budget, and then they try to figure out what they need to give us to meet in the middle. So all of our kids get categorized. I know this sounds a little Orwellian, but every kid in the school, every school district in Massachusetts is between numbers 1 and 13. So if you're a regular special education half-day kindergarten student, you're in that category, and there's a dollar amount tied to that, both in terms of the revenue and the amount it costs to provide that education. And here's all the varieties of students that you can be. Question? And I'm not a super expert on the school funding formula.
Sorry, when they
Yeah.
count the kids, they count typically developing and special ed kids in the same rate?
No, so they're special education in district and out of district, economically disadvantaged. A student can actually be in multiple categories.
Okay.
If you're
Makes more sense. I just-
yeah, if you're a traditional student with no special ed, you're not economic disadvantaged, and you're in high school, you would be here. But if you're special ed senior high, plus you have in-district services, plus you're economically disadvantaged, I mean, there's an enormous amount of data that gets calculated per student. Yeah.
Does the difference, the discrepancy between, for example, 1 and a 13 kid, does that make up the difference in the actual cost of education?
Oh, absolutely. So there's a cost associated to all of these items. So you might get $4,000 if you're here, but you're getting $8,000 if you're here. Special ed students, economically disadvantaged, you receive more funding for the state per students in those categories. So it's a catch-22. The more economically disadvantaged students you have, the more money you get from the state, but there's a higher cost to provide that education as well, which is why the state tries to balance it that way, but there's no perfect funding formula.
So this is the formula by which the state determines the aid to the town, and then is the school committee obligated to commit the funds commensurate with these calculations? Do they look at student A and B and fund that way?
No, because the state just
Okay.
gives us $1 amount, and then we pool all of our revenues as well. So there's a dollar amount associated with every student in Massachusetts. It doesn't mean that that kid gets that $4,200 or whatever it happens to be. The state has to spend according to certain categories. There's restrictions on it, but it's the state basically says by doing all of this math, which I sometimes question, and we'll talk about why it's questionable in a moment, you get X dollars and spend your dollars and provide your education. Yeah, Donna?
Does this include homeschool kids? Are they in out of district?
No, so if you're homeschooled, so that, remember in Massachusetts, the school district in the town, we actually don't get money. The student gets money. Not that it gets given to the student, but it's their education. They're able to go where they want, in effect, with that money. If they don't go to the public school, they don't get that money. Not that a check is given to the student, but if you're homeschooled or you go to Severian, the town doesn't receive any money because we're not educating you.
So how does the kid get educated?
If they go-
Directly to, I can understand it going to Severian, but does it go directly to the?
No, it doesn't go to Severian. If you don't go to the public school system, we don't get any money for you, and the state doesn't give them money for you. That's your choice. We have a legal and moral obligation to provide an education. If you choose not to take it and you want to go get something on your own, you're more than welcome to it.
So how does it work with homeschool then? They have a curriculum and everything, right?
We provide nothing, and they homeschool their kids to their heart's content.
Okay.
Yeah. Luckily, we don't have to provide homeschool, but it's Massachusetts. So you never know when we're going to have to at some point. So this is the first half of the formula. The state assumes a cost per student based on a number of different categories: administration, instructional leadership, classroom teachers, other teaching services. So in the early 90s, what the state did is they said, what does it actually cost to educate a student? They got a bunch of people together and they said, let's figure out what it actually costs to educate a student, what you should be spending per pupil in all these different categories to provide a decent education. Now, there's going to be a test on this after, so you all need to memorize the numbers that are up there in the small text. But what the state did is they said, okay, administration, $498 per pupil is roughly what we think you should be spending on administration for a student. So there's a cost number in for all of these. There's inflations. There's adjustments that have been made to the formula over the years. This is the other half of this is what it should cost. Now, as an example, employee benefits and fixed charges, $796 per pupil for high school students is what the employee benefits and fixed charges should be. The formula itself is a little dated. It came out in 1993, which actually means it was several years prior to that. Some of the cost escalators have not been necessarily consistent with reality. Benefits, it's projected about a 2.5% increase every year since the early 90s. if the cost of pensions, which the state actually provides pays for teacher pensions, we don't like to talk about that because we often attack the state for not giving us enough money, and they generally don't throw it back in our faces that they pay for teacher pensions. So I don't like to remind them of that one. But health insurance has not grown at 2.5% a year since 1993. If it had, we'd be in a much different situation, and that's every community across the country. So maintenance has a cost here, $3,300 times the number of foundation teaching and support staff. Again, they come up with what you should be, what your foundation budget is, and then they look at your wealth and they say, okay, you're a middle-class community, here's what you should be spending. How do we bridge the gap? Here's a dollar amount to help you bridge that gap. So we have a number that we call, and these are actually last year's numbers, net school spending. So the state will say, all right, at the end of the day, here's the total amount of money being spent on education. You'll notice it's different than the school budget because that includes some of those fixed costs that we budget elsewhere. So the state throws all that together, and then they also will tell you what your minimum required spending is. So the state sets a bare minimum that you cannot go below. The problem is that number is not based in reality, and there's no one spending really at the minimum anywhere. You have some districts in Western Mass, and the reason being, $16 million is technically how much less we could spend on the school department and provide a minimally acceptable education according to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I would love to see that happen because we probably wouldn't have a high school at that point. So no one actually pays attention to this, I don't say the formula. This element of the formula is something that has to be corrected because that minimum amount has grown based on these formulas over time. So the state still effectively says, well, by looking at all this, this is what you can provide an education with. This is not relevant anymore. This is not accurate anymore. And throwing in a couple percentage cost escalators doesn't work. I mean, some of these numbers are based on the 1993 number plus a cost escalator. Reality has changed this whole system quite a bit. Yep.
Now, is this determined by the Department of Revenue or by the
DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education.
Okay.
Yep. They will actually spend, you can look at, they have spreadsheets that they'll send us that put all your numbers together and magically it all works out to their formulas. But it's just the formula, there's no perfect funding formula, especially because everyone wants more money and the state only has so much money to give up. But it's a formula that's subject to a lot of change because it hasn't changed in so long. However, here's a chart real quick. So you'll notice where our actual spending is gone. The Chapter 78 has creeped up. In years it's gone down, and then it's creeped up. It's gone down again, creeped up. But you'll notice the growth isn't matching the actual growth of spending. There were years where our required net school spending, so the bare minimum we're supposed to do, has gone down according to the state. That never happens. Your actual spending never realistically goes down, especially when your student population isn't going down. Incidentally, as your student population declines, you don't see a cost savings. The reason being, when school districts see a decline in their student population, it's never even. We don't just lose 30 third graders in 1 year where we can just say, oh, great, that's one teacher we can lose. If you lose 20 or 30 students, what happens is it's 1 or 2 per grade or 3 per grade. So you're not actually able to reduce what you're doing. Perfect example, if you were all a high school classroom right now and Bob left, what's the cost of providing the service? It doesn't change. You still have a teacher here, you still have the electricity, you still have the materials. Bob and Tim could leave, and what's the cost? Still exactly the same. Which is also why I always encourage people, don't pay too much attention to the per pupil dollar amount for every school district in Massachusetts, because it really is just taking the total expenses and dividing it by the total students. And as you lose students, that number can appear to be a lot higher when you're not actually getting an idea of what the quality of the education in that community is. So I always caution people that that's too simplistic of a formula to say, well, our per pupil spending is $16,000 and it's $15,000 in Westwood, therefore they're better or they're worse, or however people want to look at it. The reason being there again, if your cost for a classroom is $100,000 and you have 10 kids in there, it's $10,000 per student. If you have 20 in there, it's $5,000 per student. What's changed? Nothing. So I always tell people, take that number with a grain of salt. However, the Commonwealth has finally started to make some changes to the Chapter 70 formula. This year, Norwood benefited to the point of a little over $1 million with the Chapter 70 formula. That number's persisted through the House's budget. The Senate budget still needs to pass it. But this is one of probably 7 or 8 years of substantial changes that would need to take place. The Commonwealth simply doesn't have the money to continue to do this every year because it's beyond the normal growth rate in the economy. The state probably needs to raise taxes to make it happen. And of course, in Beacon Hill, that's sort of a third rail. Nobody actually wants to discuss raising taxes, but the state just doesn't have the money. Like us, they're limited in where they have money and where they can get it from. They can create taxes and local options that we can't. But we would need the same impact to happen every year, 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the road. What the state did that works well is they're trying to fix some of the underfunded categories one at a time. That benefited Norwood this year. However, one of the categories they've chronically underfunded is regional transportation. Has no impact on us. Back in the 50s and 60s, the Commonwealth was trying to get schools to condense and consolidate and join regional districts. So the promise they made was, if you do this, we will pay for your transportation costs. Except they've never funded that at 100%. It's usually around 68 to 72%. So 1 year, if they continue along this trajectory, they will say it's finally time to fix that error, which will be great for those districts. We'll have no actual impact on Norwood, because we're not a regional school district, we're our own school district. So, without getting too much more into the weeds, any questions on the school aid formula? All right. Much less complicated is the state's unrestricted general government aid formula. It's largely based on lottery receipts, population, and the property wealth of the community, and it's designed to not only share in the wealth of the lottery, but to make sure that the state is sharing some of their revenues with cities and towns to provide services that we need to provide. So the formula only has 4 real points to it. It's much easier. It's the value of the per capita value of the state divided by the per capita property value of the town, multiplied by $10, which I'm guessing they came up with 20 years ago. It's just a nice even number, times the population, times what's known as the pro-ration formula, and that's the availability of lottery receipts. So when the state legalized the lottery in the 1980s, they said, well, we're going to make sure that as much of this money as possible goes into the cities and towns. It doesn't just become a money grab for the state. They incidentally haven't said that with casino revenues, but hey, the state needs their money as well. So here you'll see that as your population goes up, that's a good thing. Not enough that we would want to say, let's build more housing to get more state aid. I mean, we get like an extra $9 a person, so it's not a huge number. Buying lottery tickets is actually good for local aid, so I encourage everyone, go out and buy a lottery ticket a week. But your numbers also change relative to other communities. So in probably fiscal 21 or 22, after the census resets, these numbers will change. So we could see a big increase or a big decrease, because it's going to see where our population is, but relative to other communities. So communities that have lost population will likely see a decrease. If you've gained, you will likely see an increase. The same thing with your property wealth, but it's in relation to what's gone on in the Commonwealth as a whole. So if our rates have been growing, if property rates have been growing 5% a year, and the state's been growing 5% a year, we'll probably even out. If we've been growing 5 and they've been growing 2, we could see a loss, or vice versa. If they're growing at 5 and we're only growing at 2, our actual property wealth would appear down, which would mean more aid, which is not always a good thing. So here again, an aid formula where it's a catch-22. You want the most aid as possible, but adding people and getting poorer is what gets you more aid, so you don't necessarily want more aid. What you really want to do is try to stay relative to where you are. Questions on the state aid formula? So there's another part to state aid that we don't like to talk about, and it's called charges. So all communities in the state receive aid from the state, but then there's certain charges that the Commonwealth charges us for a variety of services that get subtracted from our aid. And this is why some years when we look at the budget and the state releases their number, what we call sort of the first half of the balance sheet is how much state aid you're getting. And we all go, yes, we're getting another $600,000. And then you click over to the second page of the state aid, and it's like, oh, but they're taking $400,000 of that away from us. So some of it is for things like county government. We're part of Norfolk County. The state has to fund the counties, so they make sure that we pay that. Rather than having us get an invoice and have to get into a process of us paying the invoice and then some town doesn't want to pay the invoice. There's some regional services, and here's actually a list, like mosquito control. Actually, just a few weeks ago, folks saw mosquito control dropping their larvicide. Those are things that the state just make the counties do, and they make the areas do, and they just take it out of your state aid, and then they pay the bill with it, just as a matter of simplicity. And then that way you don't have 351 towns trying to do their own mosquito control. A couple other things that are in here. This is our payment, our dues for MAPC. If your numbers are slightly different than mine, I did update these today. This is for when we mark a registration for non-renewal. The RMV actually charges us for it. The state just takes it out of our state aid. These are some of the school funding formulas. So incidentally, this is what we pay because we have students going to charter schools. So if anyone ever asks, do charter schools take money out of the local school district? The answer is that's the total amount for Norwood, about $1 million. And my favorite one is the MBTA here, ostensibly to pay for things like the ride, but it's really any community in the MBTA service territory has to actually pay for a portion of the MBTA. That's every town in their service territory. There's technically, I think, 116. The formula is established by state law, so sometimes you hear that the T is raising their rates and everyone gets really angry at them, and I always think to this number here, which is probably 10 teachers or something else. So we receive less state aid because we actually fund a portion of the MBTA because there's an assumed economic benefit, and there's some services they provide that we couldn't otherwise, that they don't necessarily charge for, low-income services and the like. I think the state should fund that differently, but the T as a system is broke, so I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Their pension system, incidentally, has about 12 years of life left in it. So if anyone works for the T, you should probably get out now.
Tony?
Yeah.
This is different than that, so.
Yeah, my numbers are just a little bit, I updated these this afternoon after I had printed those.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it doesn't change dramatically year to year. I think MAPC went up, $60. The county tax, there's an extra digit in there. The county tax is not $2.3 million. So your number on the county sheet is actually a little bit more accurate.
So the last one's charter schools, what's the one right before that?
School choice sending tuition. So when a student is able to, some school districts allow what's known as school choice. So what you basically say is we allow kids to come into the district. You get money for that. I don't believe Norwood does it. And the reason being that it's great if we got 12 kids and one kid was in each grade, great, we'd make $60,000. There's no extra, it's about $5,000 a student. There's no extra cost to it. But if you get 4 kids in the 3rd grade and then all of a sudden you have to add another 3rd grade teacher, you're spending a lot more money. So towns either jump into it whole hog or they don't do it. But neighboring communities that accept school choice students, if we have students that choice into those schools, that's where that cost comes from. We're basically paying that school district that money. You can't prevent them from choicing out of your district. But this is common in almost every town in Massachusetts. So it's not that there's anything wrong or bad here. A lot of times where you'll actually see, I mean, sometimes it is that you don't have a great school district depending on where you are, but sometimes it's as simple as I work in North Attleboro and I live in Norwood, so I'm going to send my kid to the North Attleboro school system because I work there and my parents live there and they accept school choice. Question?
So how much is it per student when?
It's a little over $5,000. It's based on the aid number that you would otherwise receive for that student.
So this is a reduction to
State
the
aid.
state aid to the general government.
No, this is general government and schools.
Oh, okay, I see.
It's off the total amount.
Okay, thank you.
So if you look at state aid over the last 10 years, you'll notice a couple of things. This used to be money we received, dried up. This is known as the Quinn bill. So at this point, it's probably, Bernie, when did the Quinn bill start? 25 years ago?
Oh, at least.
So 25 or 30 years ago, the Commonwealth decided that we wanted a more educated police force as a whole. So they started offering a financial incentive for police officers to get 2- and 4-year degrees and master's degrees. And they paid for most of it too, which was great. So you'd have a police officer go, they'd get a 4-year degree, they'd get a 25% raise, and you got the money from the state. Wonderful system. State decided to end their support of the system, and dump that cost directly onto cities and towns. So you'll notice we used to get money for it, and then we got less money for it, and then we've got nothing for it. Still a good system. Many towns and cities and towns already had it in their police contract that they would pay for it, so we continue to do so. But it's an example of something the state mandated, the state told everyone to do, the state funded, and then when times got tough, the state walked away from it. They didn't take the law away, they just took the funding away. The worst 3 words in the English language are subject to appropriation, at least in my opinion. But one of the important things to look at here, if you look at our total receipts and then net receipts, and that's of course how much state aid we've gotten, and then subtracting all the state's charges, the average increase in a year, absent this year, which we'll talk about, has been about $137,000 a year. So every year we're getting about an additional $140,000 in aid from the state over the prior year's amount. In a $195 million operating budget, that extra $140,000, sure it's helpful, it really isn't all that much. Covers about 2 salaries. We have 800 employees. This year, our number is actually around 11.1 million. So we finally got a decent increase in state aid, but to actually keep pace with our costs, to keep pace with inflation, the state would need to do this every year going 5 or 7 years. So that's the challenge, is that the Commonwealth, which charges a sales tax, charges an income tax, isn't keeping pace with the actual cost of education, of government services, and they're not so friendly to us in the legislature where they pass laws that continue to increase the mandates we have to pay. Most of our collective bargaining is regulated heavily by the state for pensions, for health insurance, for wages, so it's a very strictly controlled system. The state doesn't change that system. They don't change Prop 2.5. They don't raise their taxes. They just dump more on cities and towns. Yep.
Can you speak to that a little bit more about how the state manages the bargaining?
So we, in Massachusetts, some of our benefits that we offer are statutorily required, so it's state law that we offer them in the manner that we offer them. Any employee working for a city or town or school district who works 20 hours or more per week gets health insurance. We can't prorate that health insurance. So a lot of people like to say government should be more like the free market, and my response always is tell the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that. So if you work 20 hours a week for a city or town or for a school department, you get health insurance, and we pay the same portion as we do for any other employee. You were on the pension system if you work 20 hours a week or more. Routinely, you have to work 20 hours a week or more throughout the course of the year. We can't change that. The pension is based on your salary, of course, but you're on the pension system, the state requires that. We offer retiree health care in Massachusetts. The state requires that we offer that retiree health care. The percentage we offer it, we can choose if we can get folks to agree to, but we can't charge retirees a fundamental different rate than we charge current employees. You're also not supposed to be able to do grandfathering in Massachusetts with health insurance. Some cities and towns get away with it. I would never want to do it necessarily because the unions could always come back and make you pay the higher rate. But I can't just say everyone hired after this date's going to have a new health insurance number. The state doesn't allow you to do that. So how we go about health insurance and pensions in Massachusetts is strictly regulated by the Commonwealth. The pension system, incidentally, it's a pretty good pension system, but municipal employees in Massachusetts and school district employees too, of course, don't pay into Social Security. So they don't pay into Social Security and they won't receive Social Security unless they have that corresponding from the private sector. So employees pay 9% of the first, they pay basically 11% of their salary. It's actually 9% of the first $30,000 and then 11% of everything over that, but there's a weird weekly calculation in there. So employees pay 11%. We pay, the town pays an actuarially determined amount. It's anywhere between 15 and 20% of payroll, but if we were fully funded, it'd be about 11%, which once you subtract out the 6% that Social Security is, it's really not that expensive of a retirement system. It's basically the equivalent of 5 to 7% of somebody's salary on top of Social Security. The pension system is the same across the state. For every city and town and the Commonwealth. There's some minor variances. What you can get is a given raise once you're a retiree, and little things here or there are different town by town. The local retirement boards have a little bit of control over that. But the percentage of your salary that you receive for your years of service is the same all across the state. There's 4 different groups. Mainly it's either public safety or non-public safety, and then there's 2 weird state ones in the middle. So obviously police and fire can retire with a higher percentage earlier. The idea being that you don't necessarily want cops and firefighters working until their maximum retirement age if you can avoid it. But the pension system is all set in state law. So we couldn't say, let's negotiate a better rate for pensions, let's ask employees to pay more. It's all stuck in state law. We have some bargaining with health insurance, but what we offer, how we offer it, again, strictly regulated by state law. Questions on state aid and the pittance that we go up every year? Debt service. I know some folks, when they hear the term debt service, or we say that the town has debt, they're shocked and they say, what do you mean the town's in debt? When we refer to debt service, we're referring to effectively mortgages. That's the way I like to let everyone know, but it's for equipment and for capital, buildings, things like that. We don't borrow money to operate. And that's a big misconception. I know there was a letter to the paper a few weeks ago where somebody said the town doesn't need an override, it can simply borrow money to get through the year. We legally can't do that. So when we have a deficit, we can't just borrow money to close the gap. So what the federal government does, it works for them. $4 trillion budget, they only have $3.2 trillion. Well, just borrow the other $800 billion and it's all fake money anyway, so whatever. That doesn't work for us. It's real money for us. It has to really come from somewhere and it really goes from somewhere. So we can't borrow money to operate. Occasionally, cities and towns do short-term cash flow borrowing. Anyone who's run a small business, that's just sort of a borrowing to make sure you meet your payroll because your revenues come in at different times. We actually rarely do that in Norwood. Most cities and towns do, but because we have routine, we do quarterly tax billing, which actually helps the cash flow. And the light department being monthly actually helps our cash flow. So it saves us a little bit of money. But debt service is really what we borrow for any number of projects that we end up having. There's 3 kinds of debt service because nothing's ever simple in Massachusetts. We have debt service within the levy, outside the levy, and then utility debt. And the difference between within the levy and without the levy is just as how it relates to Prop 2.5. So if it's within the levy, it's just a number in our budget. So let's say we're borrowing $1 million to fix a water tank. A bad example of the water tank. We're borrowing $1 million to fix town hall. We borrow the money. It's $10,000 a year for however many years. That just goes right into the budget. It increases the expenses in the budget, and we've got to make sure our revenues match. For really large projects, school projects, or for really any large capital project, you can borrow outside the 2.5 levy. That's called a debt exclusion. The high school is an example of that. That's usually only reserved for really big projects, school projects, really big construction projects. Town Norwood size, the DPW building, or if you had we may have a big project at Town Hall in a few years, you could put those forward as debt exclusions if people want to pay that on top of their tax bill, not having it impact the amount of money in the budget. And then that stops once that project has been paid for. So the high school, for instance, there's an addition, if you will, on everyone's tax bill for the high school for this building. That gets paid off in, I believe, 2035. Realistically, 2034. The last year's debt payment is actually very small. So your tax bill will go down because we'll no longer be charging that amount in that given year. the way most of these work, there's a big amount in the first year, but 25 years into that bond, that debt amount, given the size of the tax base, is usually not that big of an impact. And then debt service paid by utilities. The important thing to remember is water, sewer, and the light department. They're often heavily indebted in any community because that's how utility services run. They always have to borrow money to fund their infrastructure. Anything we spend in those departments is paid for by those rates. So that's a question I get every now and then. Somebody says, oh, the sewer department's doing this project, and is that going to impact my rates? And the answer is yes. Your sewer charges pay for sewer projects, your water charges pay for your water projects, your light charges pay for light projects, as well as operating those departments. So that debt service always gets taken out and is paid for by those utilities. So the total debt owed by the town, about $129 million. We allocate, and I think these are actually last year's numbers, we allocate about $3.7 million a year to pay for our debt. Not uncommon for a town our size. We actually have a relatively low debt level overall. It's not super low, but it's also not high. Some towns borrow a lot more money. We are starting to see borrowing for more smaller projects, which is starting to creep up that total amount. I think this year is probably an example of that we're looking to borrow about $4 million for some projects. Some of those are smaller projects that we'd like to be able to pay for cash in the future. But even this year, the idea that we're adding $4 million to only a $129 million debt service, total debt amount, is actually relatively small. And there's always debt falling off the rolls, so there's always bonds that we're paying off. So even though we're borrowing about $4 million, our annual payment for that's going to be about $480,000. Next year's budget's only going up about $30,000 for debt service because it's targeted as things fall off. That's when you hopefully have new bonds coming on. It doesn't always work that way. And with large projects, you try to pick them in a year where you have some bonds getting paid off so the debt impact isn't as high. And then this is about what we pay every year for the high school debt exclusion. The last year payment is about $700,000, so it's 2034, and then it drops precipitously, and then it's all done. Questions about debt service and borrowing?
I mean, how did we incur 129?
So a lot of that, just about every building we have, the library debt, we're still paying for the last renovation at the library. Some of it's equipment. There's a portion of that's the light department, but that also includes every water project we've borrowed for, sewer projects we've borrowed for, light department projects that we're borrowing for. There was a light department lawsuit years ago that we're still paying off. That'll take a couple more years. But the majority of it, it's all infrastructure borrowing. So that number, that $129 number, seems like it's high. It's actually not a high debt level for a community our size. High schools now are going for about $300 million. We lucked out and got this one for I think around $80 million, and the state paid half of that. The new middle school will probably range $80 to $100 million. The DPW building was about $16 million. If we were to renovate Town Hall and truly renovate it and gut it and bring the building up to code because it's 90 years old, probably a $12 million project. The bathhouse was $1 million, what is Dave, $1 million, $1 million, $2. We just renovated the chapel, that's $1.5 million. So stuff costs money. But the overall amount is nothing to be scared of. If it was $200 million, we'd probably be approaching that point where we're rather heavily indebted.
So that's the total of all those
Correct.
construction projects that you just ticked off?
Correct. That's our mortgage, if you want to think about it that way. It's 50, 60 different projects, but that's basically our mortgage, and that's our annual mortgage payment.
Yep.
But to tie it to what you said at the beginning, the better our bond rating, the less expensive the debt is. So when we take out new debt, our annual budget allocation will be smaller.
Correct.
For the same amount of overall debt.
Absolutely. So an example would be if we had a AAA credit rating, that $3.7 million could be $3.2 million. Now, $500,000, that's money we could be paying for cash for stuff. That's money that could be going in the bank. We're always going to be borrowing money. I know I tend to be pretty fiscally conservative myself, so folks think, well, what are we borrowing money for? We don't have the cash to pay for $15 million projects on hand. I'd like us to get to the point where we could pay for $1 million projects out of cash, but even then it might be there's one project a year we can pay $1 million for. We can't do 5 $1 million projects out of cash. That's just more cash than most towns have available.
Is it possible to anticipate whether or not the override, should it pass, would have a significant effect on the rating and how that would affect the budget allocation?
It will have a positive impact on the rating because when you sit down with the rating agencies, what they're looking at is what are you doing for raising revenue? So when you go to them and you say, hey, we had some challenges in the budget and we actually went to the public and they raised our tax levy by, realistically, it's almost 10%, it's about an 8% increase. The rating agencies say, okay, good, they are raising their revenue to meet their current and future costs. So rating agencies are always positive on things like that. They want to know that you're meeting your current costs, because they know that when you start cutting back and you're not meeting your current costs, you start deferring maintenance, you start taking money out of the bank, and it'll help us make sure we have more free cash and putting more money into the bank over time. So from a rating agency perspective, they always like to see that. Same thing with your utility rates. They look at your utility rates, and are you raising your rates when you should, or are you making the political decision to say, gee, I don't want folks to get mad at me, I'm not going to raise the water rates this year, and you're just going to end up doubling it the following year. So they want to see how are you managing your finances.
Is it possible to figure out what the realized savings might be?
You could talk in a general sense, but we couldn't directly correlate saying if the override passes, the credit rating will go here, but additional revenue always helps with the credit scoring. Questions on debt service? We're getting close to the end here. One of the things I want to mention about budgets, budgets are a statement of priorities, as some folks like to say, but at the end of the day, it's a collection of numbers and where we anticipate we're going to spend those numbers. It's mainly an accounting tool, so no budget is ever perfect. You reasonably know what you're going to spend. If you have a 8th year math teacher, you know what their salary is going to be, you plug it in there. Generally, that teacher is going to come in. I mean, that number's not going to wildly fluctuate, but they could hit the lottery and move to the beach or something like that, and then you got to hire somebody else, and maybe they're cheaper, maybe they're more expensive. But it's important to remember, budgets are projections. Budgets also would vary. If you did it differently every day of the year, you would have a different number of the year. So they're sort of always in flux. Not that our spending is always in flux per se, but if you were to ask me today, what does my labor cost look like next year? I would come up with one set of calculations. If you asked me tomorrow, I would look at it and say, well, this person said that they're retiring, this person just quit, and we just hired this person, so it's changed again. And then the next day, well, we just heard that water rates went up, so it would change again. So you get as close as you can to a projection, but a budget at the end of the day is still a projection. It's a reasonably good one, but it's still a projection. One of the things we often hear is zero-based budgeting, and some folks will say, well, the town should practice zero-based budgeting. And it's important to know the history of that. It was a Jimmy Carter thing back in the 70s. Jimmy Carter was the zero-based budgeting guy, and it really applies to federal budgets, not to what we do at the local level. The federal government, especially back then, gave huge amounts of money to all sorts of different programs. The idea of zeroing out a budget and starting from zero just doesn't work at the local level. A majority of our budget is going to be what we expended the year before, because we're going to be providing the same service, and none of our services are generally things we decide in any given year whether we're going to do or not do. Small elements of them are, but I can tell you next year we're going to want a 3rd grade. We're probably going to want a whole K through 12 system, but you don't just say, well, let's zero-base the school department and decide what grades we're going to have this year. It doesn't make sense that way. Same thing with the police or fire department. Your first question is, well, do we want a police or fire department? Yes. Do we want the same patrol coverage? Yes. We want them to have a building? Yes. That's the service that's required to provide the current service. Nor could we have massive fluctuations where we currently have about 60 uniformed officers. We're not going to just say next year, well, next year let's do 32, and then the year after 45, and then go up to 90, and then cut down to 10. And then the world doesn't work that way. Same thing with the school department. We're not going to say, well, next year don't do 3rd and 4th grade. All right, we'll bring them back, but cut out the 9th grade, add them back in, but let's not do 1st grade. The world just doesn't work that way. We shrink and we grow and we shrink and we grow, but generally most of the services we want to provide in a given year, we're going to probably provide the next year, as well as our fixed costs don't actually change. We can't just say, no health insurance this year and let's just see what happens. So you'll hear that term, zero-based budgeting. It's a great theory, works wonderful for the federal government. At the end of the day, if we want to do the services that we did last year, we're going to have more or less a similar budget. And I know that sometimes frustrates people where they say, well, the budget never seems to change. It kind of goes up a little bit and then down a little bit every year. We provide the same services every given year, and it's only really going to change if we decided that there were whole services we didn't want to provide. The smaller services in the community that you might be able to get rid of that some communities would, not that we'd ever want to, your senior center, your rec center, 11 employees out of 800. Even if you added the library, that's another 19 full-time employees. So now you've gotten rid of them, what are you getting rid of? Police, fire, public works, there's really not all that much left. So that's one of the reasons you see a budget never really dramatically changes year to year. And even in the context of the override vote on June 3rd, that's not a dramatic change in the budget. It's not to say it's not a significant impact on the taxpayer, it is of course, but that's not a dramatic increase on a $196 million operating budget. Audits, one of my favorite topics. That's something you'll occasionally hear from people is, well, why doesn't that town do an audit? They'll find all the money. Most people who say that don't understand what an audit is or what an audit does. And by the way, we do have an audit every year. We're required to. Just about every city and town in Massachusetts does. If you receive more than a certain amount of federal funds, you're required to get an audit. So we do get an audit every year. You're free to read it. Email Tom McQuaid, the CFO. He'll send you a copy of it. But audits are really just an auditor's opinion on whether or not your financial statements are accurate. So if we say I'm spending $500,000 on teachers this year, they go in and they look and they say, okay, they said they're spending $500,000 on teachers. Okay, here's the teachers, here's their payroll, and okay, it all balanced out. Yeah, you did. You spent $500,000 on teachers. That way we're not presenting to town meeting a budget saying that I'm paying this patrol officer $40,000 and I'm really paying him $400,000. They do occasionally catch fraud in the context of looking at how things are being spent, looking for backup documentation. They may occasionally pull something out where they say, hey, do you realize you're spending, $500 on a toilet seat or $600 on a hammer, if they see it, but that's also not what they're there to do. There's a documentary on Netflix I encourage everyone to watch. It's called All the Queen's Horses, and it's about Dixon, Illinois. So Dixon's a town of about 16,000 people, birthplace of Ronald Reagan. And they had a treasurer who so their budget incidentally is about $15 million, which it's weird that I can tell you the size of a town and the number of their budget and then be right about it. But they had a treasurer who over the course of about 20 years stole $53 million from the town of Dixon. So in 2 subsequent years, $5 million a year from a town that had about a $15 million budget. And they only caught it, and this is the way about 80% of fraud gets caught, when somebody, the assistant treasurer, called the bank and said, I need a list of our accounts to do our monthly reconciliation. They were in a rush, so the new person at the bank sent all the accounts, not just the specific numbers that they always ask for, and that led to everything unraveling and the FBI investigating it, and this woman apparently bought horses with it and trailer coaches and all this other stuff. Their auditing firm, which also did their accounting, which is a no-no, you're not supposed to have them do the same, eventually did get sued for a lot of money because it was so blatant that they should have actually picked up on it. But year after year after year, this continued to go on. I don't know how nobody else picked up on it, although they had what's known as a commission form of government, where they had an elected mayor and then 5 or 6 commissioners who sort of oversaw different parts of the city. Most places have gone away from that form of government. The neighboring community, which had a city manager, a couple of years prior to this had actually sent them a message and said, we're about the same community, we're having surpluses every year, you're having deficits every year, you probably should look at your books, something's going wrong. But nobody could figure it out, and year after year those auditors never picked up on the fact that somebody was able to steal that amount of money. So again, I would fire an audit firm and sue them in that case, but that's not what audits are there to do. When people think auditors are there to catch people stealing and stuff like that, that's known as a forensic audit. If we wanted to look at a forensic audit, it would probably cost us $250,000 to determine if we needed one, and then probably $1 million or $2 million to actually do one. So just something you hear out there in the public. There's a misconception about what audits are. If you want to look at ours, go right ahead. You also need to take them with a grain of salt because they give you your sort of net position. They tell you this is what your business is worth, if you will. Well, for a municipal audit, they include assets like our road network. Well, that's great. I can never sell the road network. All it does is cost us money. All of our buildings are considered assets, and even though they're not liquid assets, at the end of the day, we can't just get rid of the high school because we still have to provide the service. We can't just decide, you know what, we're out of the high school business, we're not doing it anymore. There have been some accounting changes that the federal government is forcing cities and towns to do related to our retiree healthcare liability. Our OPEB liability is what we call it. We now have to reflect that full amount on our books, if you will. So technically, and this is every city and town in Massachusetts, and the country for that matter, Norwood's worth about negative $44 million right now. So that's why you always got to take the municipal audits and their definition of net position with a grain of salt, because that happened with every city and town. They saw their value go way down, and most of us are technically worth a negative amount of money. So if we wanted to sell the town as a business, it's worth negative $44 million. So always reflect on audits with just a little bit of a grain of salt, but if you want to see ours, by all means, give the town accountant's office a call. They'd be more than happy to provide you a copy. Yep.
So in terms of that goal, though, of looking through budgets, checking them, and making sure that there's a discussion about expenditures before it gets to town meeting, would that be the role of the budget balancing committee?
No, they sort of take, budget balancing sort of takes a big picture look at our finances and how are they being allocated and where do we balance that money and where can we find money, and then the operational decisions are left to the departments and then of course their respective boards that they refer to. We're always doing sort of our own internal auditing. We don't do formal internal auditing. What are we spending money on? We have a purchase order system. Some people think that government is really just nothing like a business. We really are. All purchase orders over a certain amount have to be signed by me. They go through the procurement department. They go through accounting. They go through treasury. One of the main ways we control costs is I just write angry notes on purchase orders and send them back to department heads and say, I don't like this and I think it's too much money, and then they get angry and then they have to justify it. Department heads are always looking for a better cost for something because that helps their budget too. If they know they're spending $10,000 on mulch and they can only spend $7,000, either A, they want to just be good to the taxpayers, or they're saying, hey, we can get a lot more done if we're always finding a lower cost. You tend not to hear about it as much because the majority of our costs are in our labor cost. So we don't just say, hey, I found a cop who was willing to take the job for 30% less than the last cop over there, or hey, this teacher, you know, we showed them a fake scale and they're going to get paid half what the teacher before did, or you don't walk in and say, hey, how about you don't have health insurance this year? So, you know, when we see savings in the operating budget, they're helpful, but it's 20 to 30% of the budget, whereas the rest is in that labor side where it's harder to find those savings. But that's a good question. Capital. When we refer to capital for capital outlay, we have a little debate in Norwood about should we assign a dollar amount to capital? Should we call it something specific? When you take a step back, when we're talking about capital, we're referring to our facilities, our land, our rolling stock, big equipment. I'm not necessarily a fan of assigning a dollar amount and saying anything over a certain dollar amount is a capital project or a capital expense. Perfect reason is take vehicles. Police cruiser is only about 48 grand or so, 50 grand for a police cruiser. So you think, that's kind of a low number for our size. We don't need to consider that a capital expense. But the town spends about $700,000 on its fleet every year for police, fire, DPW, the school department. So taking a step back and looking at the whole picture, we have a fleet asset worth millions of dollars that we spend between $500,000 and $1 million a year maintaining. So that's a different approach to looking at our capital spending. I'm not as concerned about is $50,000 or $80,000 the threshold. We got to take a step back from a planning perspective and say, well, we're investing $700,000 in this fleet of vehicles. And we never like to think of it as one fleet of vehicles because you don't have the DPW truck riding with the ambulance behind it and then the special ed bus. I mean, they're very segregated in what they do, but it's one vehicle fleet that the town owns as an asset that we invest an enormous amount of money in. Building projects are one of the same challenges, where it may only be a $100,000 renovation, so you say, really, I mean, especially with prevailing wage, that's not a whole lot of work. But what if we're doing 5 of those projects in a year? What if we're doing 10 of those projects in a year? Now it's, well, wait a minute, we're spending $1 million on our buildings as a whole. The full replacement value of all the buildings the town owns, including our school buildings, is around $500 million. So we look at it and say, well, we own $500 million worth of property. How much are we investing in that $500 million worth of property? And then we can get into our capital outlay meetings and fight over whether it's $50,000 or $60,000. But taking a step back, this is what we talk about when we're talking about our total capital assets and inventory. That includes our infrastructure, which is another big cost center in the budget that folks don't always realize how extensive our infrastructure is. And it's really no different than other communities in Massachusetts that are our size. But we have 110 miles of road, 119 miles of water mains, 122 miles of sanitary sewers, 95 miles of storm drains, 41 acres of cemeteries, 53 acres of athletics fields, and 9 acres of parks, including 9 playground tot lot areas. So when we talk about the need to invest in our infrastructure, the town owns and maintains an awful lot. 434 streets totaling 110 miles of road.
Does that include, for example, state-owned roads?
No, that's just what the town of Norwood owns and what we're responsible for. So most of Route 1 is not included in that figure. But a road may not seem like it's very long, but then when you start going around every street in town and all of our, I mean, again, 119 miles of water mains. Our water mains would stretch halfway to New York City if we laid them out end to end. And if you laid our water and our sewer and our road miles, you can probably get to Washington, D.C. with the mileage of infrastructure that we own. So it's quite an extensive amount of infrastructure we own, and mainly the DPW maintains all of it. So they do a pretty good job. But I've always found people are a little shocked to see how much we actually own and how much we actually have to maintain. So last part of the evening is the discussion on Prop 2.5, because people often get it a little bit confused, and I think there's some misinformation that's out there about what Prop 2.5 is. So some of you have unfortunately heard my lecture on how Prop 2.5 came about. You're going to hear it again. So in the early 1980s and then the late 70s and into the early 80s, property tax rates were actually a lot higher in Massachusetts. And there was sort of an anti-tax pushback going on across the country, but in Massachusetts as well, where folks said we need to have some sort of a limit on property taxes. So they came up with 2.5% of the total value of the tax base. So that's the total value of all taxable property in the community. And that was originally all Prop 2.5 was supposed to be. So that would mean your tax rate basically couldn't be more than $25 per thousand. And you had towns that had tax rates in the 30s and 40s back then. Obviously values were lower, but it was not uncommon to have a tax rate of $42, $35. You did have some small rural communities or some coastal communities that had a really low tax rate. And as Prop 2.5 was weaving its way through the legislature, some folks said, wait a minute, what if I'm one of these towns where I got a $6 tax rate? you're telling me that the maximum is $25. That's great, but somebody could quadruple my taxes next year. Because remember, with no Prop 2.5 limit, whatever town meeting voted, you were doing. Town meeting says, I want to vote to borrow $300 million. Man, you were borrowing $300 million. Town meeting says, nope, raise the taxes and pave $20 million worth of roads. Your tax rate was just going to go up to accommodate that. Norwood was actually ahead of the curve with capital expenditures. In that sense, our capital outlay committee was formed in the early 50s to sort of correct that problem of, well, what are we doing this year? And a mob shows up to town meeting, votes to spend a bunch of money, and your tax rate jumps $8 the next year or something obscene like that. But these communities got together and said, we don't want somebody to just quadruple our taxes or double our taxes. So that's when what's known as the levy limit, or that annual increase, came in. The number that that levy limit was set at was actually artificially set in the 80s. Cities and towns knew that it was coming. They knew that wherever their spending was is where their levy limit was going to be spent. So a lot of towns actually slashed spending at that town to get that levy limit down as low as they could, knowing it could only grow by 2.5% back then from there. 2.5%, people figured that property value would always grow, you'd always be growing, and everything would be great, but that's not always the actual case. So, maximum tax rate of $25. In Norwood, our tax base is about 5.1 billion. That number is old. That was last year's number. It's actually 5.3 now. So that would mean we'd have a maximum property tax levy of about $130 million, give or take. We're at about 75 million. So we can't increase that levy amount because this is the maximum. It's known as the ceiling. Where we're at is known as the levy limit. We can't increase that without an override. So I have $71 million here. It's actually about $75 million is the tax levy. This is the number that can't grow by more than 2.5% a year. It's 2.5% plus new growth, so plus anything that's added to the tax rate, but not increases in your value. Just because your value goes up, this number doesn't change. This number has a hard dollar figure attached to it that can't go up by more than 2.5% a year. So that number, if we use the 71 million, is about $1.7 million a year. That's what we get from increasing the property tax every year. If the tax base is growing, that number is mitigated. Your actual tax bill doesn't necessarily have to go up. But 71 million can only go up by 2.5% a year unless you have an override. We can't raise it by 5% without an override. And that 2.5% is based on this number here. People tend to not quite get that. It seems a little confusing. What does raising the levy limit means? It means raising this number right here from 71 million. Instead of it going up 1.8 million, it would go up 1.8 million plus 5.9 million.
Even if you have like Avalons being constructed all over the place, which will bring in property taxes?
So the way that that helps, that's what we call new growth. So that this number can go up by 2.5% plus your new growth number.
Okay, that's what.
So new growth is helpful, but not value changes, because a value change here helps this number. No one's near the levy ceiling except Western Mass communities.
Right.
But this number doesn't change. So if all the property values in town doubled tomorrow, this number doesn't change. We're still taking this amount of money from the tax base. Correct. That will provide some relief. If Avalon, the best way to think about it, it's a residential property, so we'll get about $11,000 for every $1 million in value. So if it's 10 million, it's $100,000. So if it's a $50 million project, it's $500,000 more in revenue a year. Now the impact of the June 3rd override is to raise this number here. There's a misconception out there on how much it actually goes up. And because we talk about different terms. We talk about how much is the levy going up, how much is the average taxpayer paying. An override lasts forever, an operational override, in the sense that it's a permanent increase in the tax levy. Now what that means is this number here, when I say the tax levy, is spread out over all of that. It permanently goes up, but it doesn't go up by that amount every year compounding. So if you raise this number by 5.9 million, the average taxpayer in Norwood's going to pay about $390 more next year. But you don't pay $390 more next year, and then another $390 on top of that, and then another $390 on top of that. So your tax bill will go up about $390 next year, and the following year it'll go up pretty much what it would otherwise go up. The cost escalator of the override is only about $9 a year. So if your tax bill is $1,000, next year it's going to be $1,389 because of the override. Forget about the regular 2.5. The following year, it's going to be about $1,398. The year after that, it's going to be about $1,408. So some people think that their tax bill goes up $300, and then the next year goes up another $300, and the next year goes up another $300. That's not how it works, unless you pass an override every single year, which doesn't actually happen. So that's important because there's a big misconception about that. Now it's that $389 plus your normal 2.5% increase, which is that roughly that number there. So it'll be a little bit higher than just that $390. But after that, this number, which gets reset to the override number, only grows by 2.5% per year. So the difference between year 6 after the override and year 7 with the override, your tax bill that year will be about $400 higher, but it's only going to go about $7 higher than if the override didn't pass. So it's that one-time hit where it goes up and then it goes up slowly from there. So if you think your tax rate sort of goes like this, like everything else, with the override it'll go like this, it'll jump up one year, and it continues growing the same way it did. Does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone, whether you agree with it or not, does everyone at least understand the impact on the tax rate? Okay. So as I talked about, Prop 2.5 just allows us to raise that number more than the 2.5%. I started saying earlier, the tax rate is really just a function of the value. If tomorrow all the properties values in Norwood, everything across the board doubled in value, the town doesn't really get any more revenue. What would happen is your tax rate would fall in half, but that $71 million number isn't changing. So if you're paying $5,000 in taxes and every home property in town doubles, including yours, I still need $5,000 from you to run the town. All it is that you're going to pay a $5 tax rate on a $1 million property instead of a $10 tax rate on a $500,000 property. So sometimes when you hear people say, oh, my value went up, my tax bill went up, isn't the town getting more money? Not necessarily, because the value doesn't impact Prop 2.5. And remember that when your tax value goes up or your assessed value goes up, somebody else's may not be going up. Somebody else's may be going down. So Donna's might go up $100,000, and Leah's goes down $100,000. Donna's screaming mad because her tax bill just went up, and then Leah's being quiet because hers went down. We shift our taxes to the commercial base as well, so we make businesses pay a higher rate than residential properties pay. You don't get any more money out of doing that. People always like to say that, can't you just make businesses pay more? We do. They actually pay about twice as much as a residential property does, but it doesn't give us any extra money. It just takes, if we're levying $1 million and $500,000 on residents and $500,000 on businesses, it then just becomes $400,000 and $600,000. So they're just paying what you're not paying. It doesn't create any additional revenue for the town. So what also can happen, though, is the percentage of the tax base that is residential versus commercial can change. So with the current reval, we know property values are going through the roof in Norwood. What you might see is residential property values increase by 7%, and I'm making that number up. Commercial values may only go up by 3%. So that could then change what you as a resident are paying, but your tax bill is also based on your property. Generally, if your house is similar to your neighbor's, you'll have a similar impact. But it might be that your property goes up $150,000 and yours goes up $75,000 because in your neighborhood that's the average and in your neighborhood that's the average, or vice versa. Or everyone going up, including commercial properties, growing at the same percentage as the residential properties, just lowers the rate and doesn't actually impact what anyone pays. But there's usually winners and losers, which is why some people say my value went up and why did my tax bill go up? But we don't often get calls from people saying, thank you, my property value went down, or my neighbor went up $100,000 and mine stayed the same, so I'm paying less in taxes. We tend not to get those calls. So just a quick comparison, and this is jumping back to, I believe, last year's numbers. You'll see Norwood's here at about a $4,800 average tax bill. Randolph is similar. Randolph has a much higher commercial tax bill. The only one that's other close is Brockton at $3,900. They have a much higher commercial tax rate as well. So the state average for this year was about $5,500. It's up to about $5,700, so we're quite a bit below the state average. You'll notice some neighboring communities, Canton and Dedham, $6,400 and $6,800. Walpole, $7,400. And then, of course, you've got the outliers, Sharon, Needham, forget about Dover, and Westwood. Incidentally, I was running some numbers recently. We're looking at a $5.95 million override. I accidentally typed in a $59 million override. And don't worry, it was just into a spreadsheet. It wasn't anything that would actually have an impact. But our actual average tax bill would still be less than Westwood if we did a $59 million override. So don't know what's going on in Westwood, but one last quick statement on taxes and fees. I said earlier that as a political subdivision of the Commonwealth, we can't just create taxes. People will say that, can't you just tax this or tax that? Government loves to tax things, but at the local level, we can't create taxes. The state has to give us the authority to do that. And it's not just simply sending in a form saying, can we do a soda tax? Can we do a gas tax? The legislature has to approve it. They very rarely approve taxes for individual communities. They sometimes do it for the state as a whole, but you've got to have a multi-community effort over a series of years, and the state still doesn't like to do it. Towns that have gas stations along the Mass Pike have been begging for a local option gas tax for years, figuring none of their residents are actually paying it. So who cares? You're just going to get a ton of money from the Mass Pike. The legislature has still not allowed them to do it. We got the local option meals and hotels tax about 8 years ago, which cities and towns were started to adopt, which brings us in, I think, around $1.6 million a year. But that was years of people telling the state, look, if you're going out to eat, it's usually because you're spending, you have money to spend. And residents aren't staying in hotels, it's always people from away, so it's the best tax that's out there. But the state does not like to create, allow us taxes at the local level. We also can't charge more for a fee or a fine than it reasonably costs us to provide that service. So people just say, oh, well, why don't you just fine these people this, or why don't you just create a fee for this? A fee has to be tied to some sort of a license or some sort of a service, or our reasonable cost. So if the clerk's office gives out birth certificates, they do. I think we charge maybe $5 or $10. I couldn't charge $10,000 for it. First of all, nobody would actually come and get a birth certificate if it was $10,000, but I can't justify to the state that it actually reasonably costs us that amount of money. Sometimes there's a volume argument where we can make a lot of money in something like building permits because we're saying, well, maybe a $500,000 building permit is extensive, but that's a really big project and there's a lot of them coming in. But on a case-by-case basis, we can't just create fees for stuff and charge outrageous fees. I know folks like to say the same thing with fines. We probably have a fine if a dog barks after 10 p.m. We can't make that a $30,000 fine and go up and say, oop, Donna, your dog's barking, $30,000, pay up. Things may or may not be easier, but we can't just create these taxes without the legislature allowing us to do it. And just quick, I mentioned this earlier with utility funds. We have 4 main utility funds. Basically, the utilities pay the utility cost. We try to balance it every year. We've made some shifts this year to make sure there's nothing that what we call the general fund is paying for the utilities and vice versa. It's never a perfect system, but every year we try to make corrections. Utility funds can generally only be spent on those things that are utility related. So we can charge a portion of my salary to the light department because I oversee the light department. I don't think I could charge a math teacher's salary to the light department because at some point when they say, how is this math teacher working for the light department, just doesn't work. So raising utility rates to cover all of our costs or more of our costs really can only be done in a way that we're recovering some sort of a direct cost. So the recreation department's a great example. I can't raise water fees and have them pay for the recreation department because the recreation department's not actually, they're a recreation department, not the water department. So that's, oftentimes people say just raise this rate or that rate. We have to reasonably tie it to the service. And for those of you who don't know, we actually make probably around $6 million a year from the light department as a combination of pilot payments, other payments, and direct profit from the light department. So the equivalent to the override is what we also get from the light department. And if you're still here, we're at the end. So that's a quick sort of overview of the terms that we use, stuff that comes up at town meeting and throughout the budget process. So I'd be more than happy to answer any questions anyone has, or, yep.
I'm confused a little bit about the override. We're going to pass a budget at the town meeting. Then we're going to vote on an override. Are we passing a budget for not having the override?
Yes. So.
And then we get the override, and then.
So I'll explain.
Get a new magic budget?
No. So there's a process in every city and town for how it works. No matter how bad the budget is, we have to pass a budget that we have to live with. We have to actually appropriate the money to run the town. What you do when you have an override situation is you have what's known as a contingent vote. So what we do is there'll be a motion on the warrant at town meeting to approve, to appropriate $5.9 million in X categories, contingent on the Prop 2.5 override passing. If the override does not pass, that money is not appropriated. So that's how you're able to not have to go back to town meeting. So you'll have, there's 4 items. There's the snow and ice, there's the road money, there's the override stabilization account, and then there's the changes to the school budget. They'll have a detailed list of theirs, but what we're saying is we hereby appropriate money for all this stuff if the override passes. If the override does not pass, then that money is not appropriated. That's why it's considered a contingent vote. Because we also, town meeting has to conclude and pass a budget one way or another.
Right.
You can call a town meeting back if you didn't want to do that and then appropriate the money, but you know how you're going to spend the money. It's not just a matter of, well, let's have an override and then have town meeting decide how we want to spend the money. So, and that's how it works in just about every town in Massachusetts. Any questions on the override, on taxes, on the budget? Yep.
Where does the money come from that goes into stabilization? That's a budget line item?
It's a direct budget line item, and the way we do it now, we borrowed about $3 million several years ago from the stabilization fund. We say borrowed, we borrowed on our own. It's like when you take money out of your own savings account, you say, well, I'm borrowing it from the savings account. And we agreed that we would pay back about $430,000 a year until we had reached where the stabilization fund was. So that's just a cost right in the budget. Every town funds their stabilization fund a little bit differently. Once we've hit that amount, we really should continue that contribution because otherwise we don't have anything going into stabilization. The last town I worked in, much smaller town, but whatever they didn't spend out of their reserve fund, always close to the stabilization fund. If you're doing a lot of free cash, you can always say every year, oh, we did $6 million this year. Well, some towns will take the first 10% and say that goes right into stabilization before we even talk about spending or doing anything. So every town's approach is a little different. You really do want to try to find as many different sources as you can, but it comes into competition with everything else.
Are there any particular reasons why the town hasn't adopted any of those types of strategies to make the stabilization fund healthier so that the bond rating is better?
So we're, yes and no. Some towns have more strict policies as to how they fund stabilization. Bernie, how had we been funding it prior to the DPW garage?
Basically, it's been funded as exigencies allow.
So they'd get to the end of the year and they'd say, oh, all right, we got
It comes in a competition.
$280,000 left, well, throw it into stabilization.
I did some numbers a couple of weeks ago, and I looked at, I was trying to think back, I think it was back in probably 2012, we had put in $50,000 as a budget thing, and then we did the DPW garage, and we put in the $480,000.
It's about, yeah.
And then we added like, I don't know, I think it was like $15,000 to that. So really out of the budget, we still didn't put in what we used to put in. With the $50,000 before that, you would expect us to put in the $480,000 and the $50,000, but we didn't even do that. So it sort of has gone downhill.
So in 2 or 3 years, once we've paid back the amount of the DPW, we realistically need to keep that allocation in the budget going for multiple more years, and that eventually will get us to a point where we're reasonably comfortable. But if we had a year where we had a decent amount of free cash, it's always good to also throw in there and just get us to that sort of breathing point where we can say, okay, it's good, and what we're contributing is good enough. Because again, what we're contributing now right out of the budget still isn't, it's still, I think, 3 years before we get to where the stabilization fund was 7 or 8 years ago. And we've, of course, grown since 7 or 8 years ago. Here and then over here. You have a question?
No, you answered it.
Oh, okay. Sue?
Town meeting, even though the overrides were $5.95 million, town meeting could allocate less than that, and then the vote would still be to raise the ceiling 5.95, but only a smaller amount could be allocated by town meeting?
Correct. So what we're really doing is giving an authorization to raise the levy amount by $5.95 billion. Town meeting ultimately controls everything. Somebody had asked me, what if next year town meeting doesn't want to spend that $5.9 million? Town meeting is a legislative body. If they want to go pave roads with it, town meeting can go pave roads with it. Generally, when you have an override, that money stays where people have appropriated it because it's a democratic process. Even town meeting doesn't want to necessarily go against the will of the public as a whole. But if next year they decided they wanted to put it all in stabilization, they could put it all in stabilization. You'd, of course, be cutting it from what you've spent it on, but ultimately town meeting gets to do as they see fit. Yep.
So the stabilization fund is basically a savings account. So
Yes.
So does the town get a good interest rate on that? I mean,
We do.
We get in there?
In total, we get about, all of our funds combined, we make maybe 250, 300 grand a year on interest, and that's treated as a revenue source. What our treasurer does, and this is common in most cities and towns, we actually work with about 3 or 4 different banks. We don't like to keep all of our money in one place. We're always shopping money around to get the best interest rate and see who has the best amount of money. Every town I've worked in, my first day on the job, there's always calls from banks saying we'd love to meet with the new manager because they all want to grab all the money that's coming. But every town I worked in, it's always been, show me your rates. I could really care less about anything else.
Who do we use?
We have some in Dedham Savings. I think we have some in Bank of Canton. Who else do we use, Bernie? It actually changes sometimes throughout the year because we're always sort of moving to chase that next best interest rate.
Yeah, what are the interest rates? Do you know?
For savings, I'd have to take a look because some of it's just they're just cash accounts. Some of it, the stabilization is usually in a variety of low yield bonds because we have to be strict about how we can invest in it.
Right.
But we're a $191 million operation, so banks like to have us because as much money comes in and out, but we spread out that risk because what we would never want, even though it's unlikely, is with a smaller bank where something happens and the smaller bank goes out, or you don't want to have it all in a larger bank where generally the fees end up being more or there's an issue there. So we're statutorily required for our investment policies, whether it's the pension fund, whether it's OPEB, or just our cash, to be as conservative as we can.
Is the retirement account fully funded?
It's funded at about 72%, I think, which is not bad for Massachusetts. We at one point were over 100% for our fund. The market has a big impact on where that goes. There's some, no, I think we're 78%. There's some as low as the 50s or the 40s. There's a handful that are pushing up against 100%. We pay into the fund. It's actually controlled by retirees. The retirement board is a statutorily established body. They determine how the money gets invested and where it goes, strict accordance with state statute. We're pledged to the fund. We record it on our balance sheet, but it's actually not our money. It's the retirees' money. So we basically just cut a check to it every year. Yep.
So every year when the tax levy percentage, like when you decide what's gonna come in this year, you don't have to do 2.5%. So I think Norwood has done less than 2.5 many times, right?
Most towns do 2.5 automatically. Now what happens is if your new growth number is more than you anticipate it's going to be, you're not actually, you're raising that dollar amount, but it gets spread out lower. So I can make it's always tough with a shifted tax rate. I can make a projection of what the tax rate impact is going to be when I do the budget, but any new growth we get beyond what we project actually lowers that amount. So when you look at the numbers, it would seem like you didn't go up 2.5% one year, but what it is that you actually grew more than you projected to. But there's no obligation to it. It's just for most towns, it's your only real new revenue source in a given year. So it's $1.8 million. If we said, well, you know, we don't want to go up that 2.5% this year, that's $1.8 million in revenue we're not going to have, but it's certainly possible. If you're growing a lot, then it means your taxes aren't going up as much. And that's that challenge between growth and development versus being able to fund the services that we want. We're reliant on the property tax because that's the system in Massachusetts. To keep that from going too high and being too much of a burden, you have to grow, but growth comes with its challenges as well. Yep.
So how does that work in a mixed-use building? So for example, if we, like the downtown overlay district.
So you got a restaurant on the first floor and apartments above. They each pay the rate according to what their use is. So that there's a value associated with that first floor. Let's say it's $1 million. They pay the commercial rate. The residential above it pays the residential rate. Just as if you have a 2 or 3 story commercial building, they're paying the whole commercial rate. Even if you had 5 stories of commercial and 1 of residential, they'd all pay the commercial rate, and the guy on top pays the residential rate. And it's the same. We don't have too many buildings that are sort of mixed on the same ground floor. But there's a calculation based on, so if you had storefronts and then apartments in the back or something like that, it's really a square footage calculation that figures out, okay, this percentage of the building is commercial, this is what the value of that is, you pay the commercial tax rate on that portion. That's a good question. Other questions on the budget, taxes, municipal finance? Everyone feels ready for town meeting? There's one last thing I just want to bring up. Everyone that's a town meeting member will be getting a letter later in the week. We're going to attempt a consent agenda for the budget this year at town meeting. Many towns use a consent agenda to go through their whole warrant. And all it is that we're going to read through all the different budget appropriations. If somebody wants to discuss one, amend one, change one, you just yell hold. The moderator will make a little mark. He's going to run through the other budgets. Everything that doesn't get hold, we'll take one vote to approve in bulk, and then we'll go through all the different line items that people have held. Towns do this generally to let people focus on what they want to discuss and reduce the procedural process. Our budget is about 50 separate votes. Last year it was about 75 separate votes. So going to the consent agenda, generally instead of saying, and now Article 8, Section 15, and I hereby move to approve $50 for the vote, and then to the FinCom, and then to here, and we hear from town meeting members a lot that we're spending a lot of time on the procedure, and a lot of these are the smaller department budgets, and folks don't really want to discuss the moderator's budget. We always pick on that one. Folks want to get to the larger budgets or certain areas. We're not doing the whole warrant that way, just Article 8, which is the operating budget. So when we get to the Article 8 on the budget, the moderator will start reading off, Selectmen, Finance Commission, General Manager, Moderator, whatever happens to be. Anyone you're going to want to debate or discuss, you just yell hold. Yep. Finance Commission, Moderator, Police Department, Fire, hold. Okay. And then at the end, what you usually see, and there's no guarantees this will happen, is that there's probably half or more of the budgets that nobody wanted to discuss. You just sort of approve in bulk, and then we go back to the discussion on what people have held. Because it's the first year, the moderator said, of course, if somebody held the wrong budget or had a question on another budget, we're going to go back to it. The goal is not to stifle discussion. It's just to reduce the 50 votes down to maybe just 10 and let the time be focused on what we're actually doing or what folks want to actually discuss. Yep.
I was talking to somebody who said he was slated to talk on Monday. Does that mean he's gonna say hold, and then when it comes to that, I mean,
So if he wants to register to speak, then we would hold that automatically. What will often happen is, the school department will usually hold the school budget because they want to make a statement on it, or if the fire chief wants to talk about his budget, usually someone tells the moderator, look, we know we're going to hold this. The larger budgets are likely to get held. We're not doing the capital or the other items on the warrant. We're just trying to start it off this year and see how it works with Article 8.
okay, cool.
Yep.
Just so everybody here knows that town meeting has a group of people that get together under the direction of our, what do you call him? Dave Hearns? Moderator. And we normally, that is how we decide how the meetings are going to be run.
Mhm.
So as town meeting members, you have the right to have this discussion on the floor before anybody decides to whether or not, I'm sorry, Tony.
It's actually the moderator's discretion in Massachusetts to use a consent agenda, but we do have a rules committee. After speaking with David and then the chair of the FinCom and the Board of Selectmen, they're going to propose going forward with this because there's some items on the agenda that folks really want to focus on this year.
But just to let you know that you have some say on this, and you, Mr. Hearns usually, and this is the way we have always run this, that Mr. Hearns gets together a rules committee before you decide to make this very significant change in how you run your meetings.
Mhm.
Okay?
Yeah. Majority of the communities in the Commonwealth actually do it. We're a little behind the times in having not done it. I don't know how many towns are left with the 50 to 75 budget appropriation votes. Most towns have gotten it down to about 6 separate budget appropriation votes.
So it sounds like actually people will have the option to discuss and each, whatever it is.
You can, if you want to hold all 50 articles and discuss them, you are absolutely welcome to.
No, unless you're getting some cots and.
Yeah. What you find most years is that an overwhelming majority of the budgets just pass without any discussion. Because again, you get to the clerk's office, well, there's $5,000 in office supplies, $2,000 in travel, and the people in the clerk's office, and there just generally isn't all that much to discuss. So we keep hearing from town meeting members that how can we reduce the procedural time that we're doing things. Most towns do a consent agenda. And again, nobody wanted to do more than trying to budget this year. Some towns will pass zoning through a consent agenda. They will have everything on that consent agenda where you just, Article 6, the MUOD didn't get held, it passes. David?
Yeah, just to that point, I would, that also.
Majority of the communities in the Commonwealth and the times in having not.
Discuss and each, whatever it is.
You can, if you want to hold all 50 articles and discuss them, you are absolutely welcome to.
No, unless you're getting some cots and.
Yeah. What you find most years is that an overwhelming majority of the budgets just pass without any discussion. Because again, you get to the clerk's office, well, there's $5,000 in office supplies, $2,000 in travel, and the people in the clerk's office, and there just generally isn't all that much to discuss. So we keep hearing from town meeting members that how can we reduce the procedural time that we're doing things. Most towns do a consent agenda. Do more than trying to budget this year. Some towns will pass zoning through a consent agenda. They will have everything on that consent agenda where you just, Article 6, the MUOD didn't get held, it passes. David?
Yeah, just to that point, I would, that also.
Majority of the communities in the Commonwealth and the times in having not.
Discuss and each, whatever it is.
You can articles and discuss them, you are absolutely welcome to.
No, unless you're getting some cots and.
Yeah. What you find most years is that an overwhelming majority of the budgets just pass without any discussion. Because again, you get to the clerk's office, well, there's $5,000 in office supplies, $2,000 in travel, and the people in the clerk's office, and there just generally isn't all that much to discuss. So we keep hearing from town meeting members that how can we reduce the procedural time that we're doing things. Most towns do a consent agenda. Do more than trying to budget this year. Consent agenda. They will have everything on that consent agenda where you just, Article 6, the MUOD didn't. David?
Yeah, just to that point, I would, that also.
Majority of the communities in the Commonwealth and the times in having not.
Discuss and each, whatever it is.
You can absolutely welcome to.
No, unless you're getting some cots and.
Yeah. What you find most years is that an overwhelming majority of the budgets just pass without any discussion. Because again, you get to the clerk's office, well, there's $5,000 in office supplies, $2,000 in travel, and the people in the clerk's office, and there just generally isn't isn't all that much to discuss. So we keep hearing from town meeting members that how can we reduce the that we're doing things. Most towns do a consent agenda. Do more than trying to budget this year. Consent agenda, they will have, you just, Article 6, the MUOD didn't. David?
Yeah, just do that. When I would, that's also.
Majority of the communities in the Commonwealth and the Times and having not.
Discuss and each, you know, whatever it is.
You can absolutely welcome to.
No, unless you bring some cots and.
Yeah. What you find most years is that an overwhelming majority of the budgets just pass without any discussion. Because again, you get to the clerk's office, well, there's $5,000 in office supplies, $2,000 in travel, and the people in the clerk's office, and there just generally isn't all that much to discuss. So we keep hearing from town meeting that we're doing things. Most towns do a consent agenda. Do more than trying to budget this year. Consent agenda, they will have, you just,